Thanks, Zach. Hi, everybody. Appreciate you all coming out to this. So exactly 2 years ago, New York City passed what is called the Climate Mobilization Act, which is a group of 6 local laws intended to advance New York City's climate resilience and keep the promise of the Paris Agreement. So among that group of 6 laws was Local Law 97, which established greenhouse gas emissions caps or greenhouse gas emissions limits or budget for all buildings that's existing and new construction for all buildings over 25,000 square feet. So let me get myself moving here. Besides establishing the limits, this local law also created a Department of Buildings Office of Building Energy and Emissions Performance, OBEEP for short. You always have to have a great acronym. It helps get your program going better. The law also convenes an advisory board of stakeholders as well as agency folks to review the law's progress, opine on rulemaking around that local law, and then propose future limits. It also, the law requires a study for establishing a carbon trading strategy and then a mechanism for implementing carbon trading as part of maintaining our greenhouse gas emissions limits. On top of that, it sets requirements for the city's own portfolio of buildings, which is more portfolio wide rather than individual building level, and creating strategies for New York City's affordable housing and the New York City Housing Authority. If we look at greenhouse gas intensity from about 2016, we see the targets, we see the energy consumption or emissions for the worst percentile of buildings in the city on the left down to the best 1 percentile, the best first percentile on the right. And in order to make this law feasible, we've established initial targets that can be accommodated or are already implementable or feasible by the lion's share of existing buildings in the city. And that first reporting period is in 2024. Then in 2030, the target limits get adjusted, the screws get tightened and ratcheted down, and we start to see that a larger swath of the buildings of the city's built environment may have to do something, are not just going to be copacetic in their current condition. And then by 2050, the screws get tightened actually 2 more times, and the lion's share, pretty much all buildings in the city, will have to do something in the way of upgrades to comply with the law. So each building, each property has a greenhouse gas emissions budget that is based on its occupancy. So based on that occupancy classification in the building code, there is a factor that it gets applied in terms of number of metric tons equivalent of carbon per square foot of that building, depending on what type it is, whether it's an office building, a school, a hospital, a multifamily apartment building, and so forth. There are different factors that come up with that greenhouse gas budget. Design professional is required to calculate that emissions limit or that emissions budget and report that to the Department of Buildings. This is going to be done on an annual basis. So you have the building has to track its energy consumption and do this greenhouse gas calculation every year and report it to the Department of Buildings. And if a building exceeds its greenhouse gas emissions budget, there is a penalty that is assessed to the building. And it's a pretty significant ding on the order of $268 per metric ton of CO2 equivalent that the building is over its greenhouse gas budget. So here's a typical example. A building that's greenhouse gas emissions budget based on its occupancy and its size would have an annual GHG budget of 935 metric tons of CO2 equivalent. Based on its energy bills, it's actually producing 1,630 metric tons equivalent. So that's a pretty, now you're looking at a 6-figure penalty for that building for exceeding its GHG budget. Now, the thing to notice about that's annually. That's not once and it sits there. The building has to report every year, and for every year that building is above its GHG limit, that fine gets imposed. So that dollar amount is very impactful and can run into some serious money in a hurry if a building is not being a good citizen. The city has created via an NYU CUSP program, a dashboard, an online dashboard that anybody has access to. And you can go to this and plug in your building's address and see a number of things. Its actual EUI, and if it has an Energy Star score, which now most buildings must have based on another New York City law, you can get the Energy Star score for that building, its water use intensity, and its greenhouse gas emissions intensity. And just through the dashboard, you can actually see how's my building stack up vis-a-vis its 2024 first reporting year. Am I within my budget or not? And then going out to 2030 when the screws get tightened, how do I sit? Am I going to really have to start planning for some retrofits to make sure my building is in compliance? So for the law, here's this timeline. The carbon study, carbon trading study is underway. The advisory board has convened and has been meeting. OBEEP has a base staff and is looking to add resources and is gearing up in anticipation of 2024 and the actual 2025 reporting year. There is a deadline. There's an allowance in the law for a request by an individual property for a variance based on its circumstances. And the deadline for variance requests on its GHG limits is due probably around the middle of the year. I forget the actual date, but that's coming up pretty quickly. There's a rulemaking process that's underway that'll take at least another 2 years probably to come about, which is a bit of an irony to me in that we pass a local law and a lot of people assume that if a law passes, the program is set up, all the mechanisms are in place, the resources are available, when the reality is that laws are very often aspirational. And it takes a bit of time for the actual implementers of a local law or a requirement to get the team together, to get the resources in place, to bring it about and bring about full implementation. And then, as I said, in 2030, the limits are going to get adjusted again, so the screws are going to get tightened. So some key points. This applies to New York City. Actually has over 1 million buildings that exist already. But given setting the bar, at least for the moment, at large buildings, which are the lower hanging fruit of 25,000 square feet and larger, this applies to about 50,000 buildings across New York City. As I said, the limits are based on building occupancy. And based on the calculus, the anticipation is that we'll get a 40% cumulative reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from buildings across the city by 2030. There are two other things to note. Affordable housing or subsidized housing is not subject to these greenhouse gas emissions limits. Ironically, the environmental justice folks really pushed back against this law. Actually, they did two things. They said the law wasn't aggressive enough, and then they said they wanted a carve out for affordable housing, which is approximately, actually, in terms of multifamily housing in New York City, affordable housing is approximately 40% of the total housing stock in New York City. So the law has already been amended, and this carve out for affordable housing is only for buildings that are 35% or greater in the number of units in the building that are subsidized or affordable. And if you're in that carve out, you don't have to meet the GHG limits, but you do have to comply with a prescriptive package of energy saving retrofits. So back to Mike Fowler's stealthy way of getting at the same thing. And now for me, the biggest thing about Local Law 97 is that this is a move, a fundamental paradigm shift from what I call design promises. We have codes that require us to design our buildings to to certain metrics and certain requirements. And we designers produce documentation and hand it to a building official and say, here's how I am promising that I am complying with the code. What we on the enforcement side have not been very good at is the follow-up after the fact to confirm that the building as designed is performing as designed. So we don't know, we frankly have fewer mechanisms and not very effective mechanisms on measuring that. So here's the paradigm shift to Local Law 97. The law is agnostic about how you get there. The law says we're not going to depend on design promises. We are now making requirements for actual measured performance. And this is true for and we're taking an even bolder step and saying not just for new construction, this is for everybody, existing buildings as well. And over time, we are going to have to retrofit the lion's share of the buildings in New York City for those buildings to remain within compliance with this local law. So we took a look at, in developing law, we looked at median EUI for buildings across the city, starting with those that already exist. And what's that? We measure our energy consumption already. We've been doing that since 2009. So existing buildings, that median EUI is right there at about 191. And then we compared that to a reference building that's modeled in ASHRAE 90.1, 2010 versus ASHRAE 91.1, 2013. And then what's 25% better than that, or 50% better than the New York City median, and then what's passive house. And we're seeing that passive house is giving us significantly better performance than any of these other strategies, both in commercial buildings and in multifamily. So now the law has been in place for a bit, and a team was assembled by the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development, which is the city's affordable housing agency, Bright Power, the Community Preservation Corporation, Stephen Winter Associates, the Building Energy Exchange, and the Mayor's Office of Sustainability's New York City Accelerator to see what the impacts are economically on this local law and the ways to get at that. So I would encourage you to go check this out. There is a playbook that has come out of this study. It's available online through the Building Energy Exchange. And it's cool. It's a very cool playbook. It actually looks at, well, what does this mean? What's this, starts to get at what does this local law mean? They used a couple of control groups. They used a pre-2003 existing building group and a post-2003 construction group based on New York City benchmarking data. These are buildings that already exist and were designed in accordance with existing codes. And then they looked at two passive house study groups, one with with a gas heating system, and a group of several projects with electric heat. And the findings were interesting, that the passive house group performed significantly better, which we would expect. And we would also expect that the electric heated passive house group performed better than the gas heating. And then if the project was actually passive house certified, that those buildings perform better still. So what does this mean for carbon? And what does this mean for our future? We see that passive house can get us to compliance with local law 97, even out to 2050, when the requirements, the screws have been tightened down a number of times. It gets us passive performance. It's beneficial to the building. It is probably one of those only ways that we're going to get at an envelope, get at this law, by being envelope forward and passive by definition. We're not using fossil fuels to accomplish this. The study also discovered that essentially all of the passive house buildings can potentially create a carbon, carbon bank account, so to speak. And if carbon trading, if that carbon trading study comes into law and those mechanisms get set up, that building owners may find, if they've gone passive house, that they have an asset in their saved carbon that can be traded and further be of benefit, both in complying with the local law and as an asset and something tangible to sell for the benefit of the property. That's a lot, you know. It's a cool place to be in. I think back to the paradigm shift from design promises to real measured performance is a way we're probably going to go, and we'll probably need to go in all jurisdictions to actually get to the places we need to go. I'm reminded of the architect Chris Benedict and her partner Henry Gifford, who created a little one-act play that they performed before the AIA New York, the local AIA chapter, one time. That was called, this little play was called The Perfect Energy Code. And here's Chris, the architect, bringing her drawings and documentation, and is so angst-ridden, and has this audience with the code official, and she's all freaking out about how she's going to demonstrate the energy performance, and the code official just says, "Don't worry about it. It's just a number. Here's your number. Do that." And here we are. It's now the law. So thank you all. Appreciate this. Thanks for having me in this. And I'm going to turn it back to Zach.